I want to start off with a title of a chapter of a UCC environmental ethicist, Daniel Spencer, who is the chair of environmental studies at the University of Montana at Missoula. It's called Earth Restored to the Earth and Earth Restored. And there's a dual mutual relationship. Being restored to the earth means really renewing our relationship, making our relationship with nature right. I would argue that one of the problems has been with the colonizations of the America, that European colonization made a justification for taking indigenous lands by saying it was terra nullius, a wasteland. So therefore it was not used for profit, and that profit was God's commandment to use the land. So we displaced indigenous peoples with that. We also brought people over from Africa and made them property. And we're still working on that resolution because we made Black folks inferior, and we've been dealing with racism. And of course, women were property in marriage. The word to wed means to pay the bride's price. Again, we have to talk about right relationships with one another. I would also add that nature has been enslaved. And because of human beings saying that nature is there for our benefit, they can recklessly do what they want. And that has been destructive, because the way we're going, it is going to lead to a sixth extinction, a catastrophe. And I want to say that we in the UCC have been evolving through our resolutions to defend nature. And I can go back to the divestment from fossil fuel companies, to basically condemning mountaintop harvesting, to the Green New Deal, to the earth belongs to the Lord, to the carbon dividend. All of it's been going to defense of nature. I want to say that it's time for us as a community, a religious community, and we would be the first Christian polity to say this, that nature has rights. And I think this is really important, not only as a defense against the reckless exploitation, but also putting limits on what is being done to nature by the fossil fuel companies and other corporations in terms of the pollution of our waters. So certainly I want to say that for religious people, it is very indicative that in both testaments that nature and creation is a gift. We've lost the sense of giftedness. We've made nature into a thing. One of my favorite writers, Robin Hall Kimmerer, an indigenous ethnobotanicist, says, nature is not an it, and developed pronouns from her indigenous culture to say, just as LGBT folks have pronouns for he, his, cisgender, etc., he and kin as pronouns to make it less impersonal and more personal. And I want to say that within that, we have to talk about what can we do to really, in our community, say publicly that corporations have rights of people, but nature doesn't. Who speaks up for nature? And I argue that we need to really take on this and really align ourselves with the rights of nature groups we have here worldwide. When I teach ethics, and many universities do, they include Earth Charter that comes from the Southern Hemisphere and really takes into consideration the rights of nature. Pope Paul, Pope John, or Pope Francis comes out of the Southern Hemisphere, and he says in his address to the United Nations, nature has rights. And I think that we have to articulate that as a religious premise, but also a human premise. We are citizens of the earth, and we should not basically take a position of superiority, but one of kinship and alignment, that we are dealing with our own kin. And so we need to co-live with nature, restore a connection with nature that is not only respectful, but also seeing that it produces us. I want to say, as a historian of religion, that all the world's religions start in nature. Moses at the burning bush in Mount Sinai, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Jesus in the wilderness, Zoroaster at the river, Lao Tzu and Confucius in nature, indigenous peoples in nature. The earth is a place of encountering the sacred. And we have to fight for the sacred because we are harming the sacred. When we do destructive things to the earth, we are performing not only ecocide, but we're also wounding the divine. And so I think we have to come to the defense of nature very strongly. Now, I'll tell you, there are a couple of groups that started defense of nature, not only legally, but there is the Guardians of Gaia, kind of an informal sort of group. But Matthew Fox, the Sacred Order of the Earth, trying to get folks to go through programs to really come to the defense of the earth and really commit themselves to that. We need, as a community, and I would argue that for the UCC, if we do this publicly, commit ourselves, we're going to find other polities also following suit. And I think this is really a very critical time that within the next 10 years, we have to be a blockage to the reckless destruction of our climate. We are losing species. 2.2 billion years ago, we started evolution on this planet, and it was a movement towards biodiversity. And we cannot survive as a species, to be selfish for a moment, without that diversity. We are intricately interconnected to the web of nature. We are all interconnected. The fact that most of the folks in the fossil fuel companies are libertarians, which come out of the Ayn Rand school of thought, it's all about us. They don't care that really we're interconnected. It's a profound selfishness, a greed, short-term profit at the expense of humanity and all of life. And so I would argue that this is a really opportunity at this time for the UCC to be prophetically at the vanguard to come to the alignment of and defense of nature. Indigenous peoples have been putting their bodies online. And if you want to read a really horrendous book, but it's a good book, Slow Violence by Rob Nixon. It details in the Southern Hemisphere what has been happening and the fact that there have been people that have been assassinated and killed and martyred in the defense of nature. Many of these are indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples in our own culture have really kind of pioneered this. I really got excited about this with Standing Rock because Standing Rock was innovative. It brought something to American public, was not only the human rights issues of indigenous peoples, but the rights of nature were combined with that. They were defending not only sacred lives, but their kin. The river was kin, water was kin. And so I think that it's time for us to align with these worldwide justice groups because we proclaim to be a justice community and to maintain that justice is really important for all of us and for a better flourishing life, that we will not flourish as human beings unless nature flourishes. So I'll leave it there, but I'll encourage you to look at the resolution. I've put together a study guide. There's a couple of good clips of folks on the rights of nature. They're short. They're only 17 minutes. TED Talks, worth looking at. There's a documentary that's more extensive. And I would also point out that there is also a biblical theological rationale that's combined with that for church folks to process through. I would say that I'm available for folks to do webinars, to have discussions with groups, green groups, etc. And I'm looking for endorsements from churches because I feel very insecure going before a conference. I've never done a resolution before and gone through the process of this. So I'd like to have some cushion of safety there to bring it to our general conference. So far I have 5 churches committed to it. Now I want to introduce Tish O'Dell. 2.5 years ago, my husband was pastor at the UCC in Petaluma, and it shared a facility with the Unitarian Church. And a Unitarian member there asked me if I knew about the rights democratic movement. And I said, well, I've heard of that kind of off key. And she said, I'd like to, for us, both congregations, to do a joint one on the rights of nature. So I Googled and I came up with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And that's how I became acquainted with it and talked with them. But my husband took a job in New Hampshire, so I had to move with him and never got through with that. But I also really started working more heavily, and it was included in a book that's forthcoming called The Insurgency of the Spirit in October, where I do talk about the rights of nature and the importance of that. So I want to say that Tish O'Dell is a community environmental legal defense fund organizer in Ohio, working on community rights and the rights of nature in their communities. And she has been also part of the biotic rights of Lake Erie and is close to where Brooks is. So maybe we can align and work together. So Tish, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Bob. First of all, I want to thank you, Bob, and the UCC for inviting me to share my thoughts on rights of nature with you today. And I also want to thank you for taking the first steps. And the first steps is educating yourselves and then also your communities by drafting and hopefully passing your resolution to support rights of nature. You know, because like you said, we're in a crisis. I mean, and we need to start acting like we're in a crisis. Although I do realize when you turn on the news some days, you know, it's overwhelming because we seem to be in the midst of several crises. And so it's difficult to focus, pick which one you want to focus on. But for the next 25 minutes, I'm hoping that we can focus on our environmental crisis and on the rights of nature. Can you see the screen? Is that all working? Looks good. Okay, good. So rights of nature should be a really simple concept. I mean, if nature is comprised of living beings and ecosystems that sustain all other life, then it makes sense that we as humans who are part of these ecosystems would want nature to be healthy so that we can be healthy. I mean, so many times I encounter people who are so consumed with being healthy. You know, they going to the rec center and they're running on treadmills and, you know, they're doing all these things to be healthy. And I sometimes wonder, and sometimes I point out to them, I'm like, do you ever make the connection though, that as you're on that treadmill and you're breathing heavy, that you could be breathing air with toxic particulates in it? Or that when you reach for that water bottle, you know, that the water in it may have toxins, or when you reach for that healthy snack afterwards, which could be a piece of fruit, that it's sprayed with pesticides. You know, these are all connections that people are gonna have to start thinking about. Let's see, having an issue here, changing my, oh, there we go. So if non-living entities, corporations in our culture and legal system have recognized rights, then of course living entities that support all life should have rights. I mean, this doesn't seem like a problem. It makes sense to most people. Now the problem, and some of these statistics are already probably outdated, which is sad because that means they're probably worse. But in the United States alone, if we just look at a few of these, 90% of all original forests have been cut. The second one, about the 2 trillion pounds of livestock waste are discharged annually into waterways. Now that affects what Joe was saying about in Florida, that affects them there. It affects Lake Erie. And that second part I put there, I did look that up, so I know that's current. So of those 2 trillion pounds, over 700 million gallons of this waste is being deposited in the Western Lake Erie watershed. When you look at some of these statistics about water, that approximately 40% of our lakes and rivers are too polluted for fishing, aquatic life, or swimming, and that was back in 2015. Or that the World Health Organization estimates that over 3.5 million people will die from water-related diseases a year. And because I'm in Ohio, I focus a lot on Ohio statistics, but the Ohio River, a lot of people don't know, has been named the most polluted river in the United States for over a decade. So I don't know how we can say with a straight face that we have the best environmental laws in the world when these are the statistics we're looking at. I mean, the problem is that almost after 50 years after the adoption of our landmark federal environmental laws, by all these statistics, things are worse now than before the laws were passed. So people should be starting to make a connection here. So what are the rights of nature? Well, environmental degradation is advancing around the world. The United Nations has warned that we're heading towards major planetary catastrophes. There's a growing recognition that we must fundamentally change our relationship between humankind and nature. Making this fundamental shift means recognizing our dependence on nature and respecting our need to live in harmony with the natural world. And part of this means securing the highest legal protections and placing the highest societal values on nature through the recognition of rights. Now, why is this? Because our culture and legal system is based on rights. You know, indigenous cultures around the world, as Bob talked some about, they don't have the same cultural views as we do. They don't put humans and human rights above nature. They understand that humans are part of nature and not separated. You know, so many times here, I talk to people and they talk about, well, I'm going to go to the park, or we have to protect the parks because that's where I go to be in nature. You know, there's a separation that's occurring there in people's minds when you talk that way. No, nature is all around you. You're part of nature. Indigenous people don't view nature as something that needs to be managed by humans. Our legal system and culture sees the relationship with nature as hierarchical instead of interconnected. So when you talk to indigenous people, they wouldn't even understand, why do you even need a law to give nature rights? They understand culturally that if you harm nature, you're harming yourself. So it makes no sense, right? Why you would need a law stating that you can't put poison in your river if that's your source of water. Like, who would do that if you change your mindset? I'm only bringing this up to show you that we in our culture have a hard time envisioning what something different than our culture teaches us could look like. Because rights of nature is a paradigm shift, not only in law, but also in culture. But back to our Western reality here. The human right to a healthy environment. Many nations have expanded their body of legal rights to recognize the human right to a healthy environment. This includes Spain, France, Portugal, Greece, Finland. However, as global warming accelerates and ecosystems are pushed to collapse, we're finding that the human right to a healthy environment cannot be achieved without securing rights to the environment itself. This means recognizing in law the right of nature to be healthy and thrive on our own. So the question then becomes, why is this idea so threatening to the current system? Why is there so much opposition to rights of nature? Why will you possibly get pushback for passing a rights of nature resolution when most of the people, when they hear what rights of nature is, are in favor of it? Because rights of nature is about expanding rights. And whenever rights are expanded, there's a power shift that takes place. If we look back at history and we take voting just as one example, when only white men with property could vote, who held all the power to make the decisions and the laws? And for whose benefit? Obviously, the white men with property. So when white men without property got the right to vote, what happened? They gained some power over the decisions and the laws that were passed. So there was a shift in the balance of power with that. You know, and we see this whenever any rightless group gets rights. Blacks, women, currently incarcerated individuals and convicted felons, they don't have the right to vote, but if they would get that, that all involves some shift of power, who gets to be involved in making decisions and making laws. So we know that nature can't vote, so why the fear to extend rights to nature? Well, voting is just one way that the powerful exert control. Another way is through the ownership of property. And in our culture and system of law, we only consider nature as property to be owned. And the owner of the property has the authority to do what they want with that property. They can mine it, they can clear cut it, they can dump in it, you name it. And just so you know, they get a permit to do harm to nature. And when they get that permit from the state, it makes that harm legal. I mean, you have to think about the word. It permits the harm. And the permit itself is also property under our current system of law. And that also can be sold. So when you hear a lot about oil, if your single issue happens to be oil and gas drilling, you know, they get leases to drill and a permit that makes it legal for them to do that, well, they can also sell those permits to other oil and gas drilling companies. So what I want to do is look at the Lake Erie Bill of Rights as a current example of a rights of nature initiative and law. So back in 2014, the people of Toledo experienced a severe water crisis. And this started forcing people to really start thinking about their problem and its cause. They had been experiencing algae blooms in Lake Erie for well over a decade, but never like what happened that August 3rd in 2014. They woke up and 500,000 people lost the use of their water for 3 days. I don't mean just don't drink the water or boil it before you drink it. It was do not touch the water. That meant don't do dishes, don't take a shower, don't do your laundry. So that had a profound impact on the Toledo residents. And these are just some pictures. FEMA came in, the shelves were cleared. People, I heard of people, they had to drive 100 miles to find water. Now again, that creates, not everyone had the ability to be able to drive 100 miles to get water. It was no secret in Toledo, the big corporate agriculture, which was located outside the city, was harming the community's water and Lake Erie. The people had spent years pleading with their electeds, the regulatory agencies, and with the corporations to stop. But instead, the state issued more permits and gave the industry more exemptions to laws, and the problem continued to get worse, not better, obviously. The people at one point even sued the EPA and still got no relief. The reason I like to put this up because, the current model, and this is how we're all taught to think because this is the culture and the system of law that we're all raised in. The current model is, well, we'll test more. We'll test more often, and then we'll add more chemicals and chlorine and different things to the water so we don't have the water crisis again. But is that really solving the problem? I don't think so. What the people realized in Toledo was that the corporations' rights superseded theirs and that Lake Erie didn't have any at all. They learned in real time how our system of law and culture sees nature as rightless, but corporations have all the rights to harm the lake. Now let's not forget either that the law is not necessarily a reflection of what's legitimate, just, or moral. So the people in Toledo began the long, difficult journey of proposing the Lake Erie Bill of Rights as an amendment to their city charter. They worked with CELDEF lawyers to draft the language that they wanted. Then they hit the streets to collect signatures to get their proposed law on the ballot. In Ohio, we supposedly have a constitutional right to propose laws directly to the people. But as you can imagine, as more people have exercised that right, that's also being eroded. The system doesn't like that. It's a power shift, right? Within 2 years, the people of Toledo had collected more than enough signatures to place their law recognizing the rights of Lake Erie on the ballot. However, they ran into another obstacle. Their local board of elections then voted to keep it off the ballot. And they went to court. They lost in court. But I always like to say there was some divine intervention or the universe seemed to align because there was another initiative that was being proposed at the exact same time as the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was. And it was unrelated to rights of nature completely. But the court ruled that that could go on the ballot and the city decided to hold a special election. And that's how the Lake Erie Bill of Rights got on the ballot. If there hadn't been that other initiative, it wouldn't have happened. So now they entered the campaign phase of promoting a rights of nature law. Almost immediately, the airwaves were filled with anti-Lake Erie Bill of Rights ads. The ads were running hourly on the radio and mailers were getting delivered to people's homes 2 to 3 times a week, claiming that it was outsiders pushing for this law. That was real news to the people who had worked in Toledo for 2 years to get it on the ballot. And it was discovered only after the election took place that the anti-group who claimed that it was outsiders were actually registered in Columbus, which is 2 miles away from Toledo. and that their funding of $300,000 came from BP North America in Houston. Now you have to realize the residents in Toledo only raised $6,000 for their entire campaign. But it passed in spite of that. And I still believe, again, see, this is all that perfect storm of things just coinciding, because they knew what it was really like to not have water. So all the scare tactics of the opposition that, you know, businesses were going to close, they knew that businesses closed when you didn't have water. However, within 12 hours of the election results, which the people won by 61% of the vote, a lawsuit was filed by a corporate farm entity outside the city of Toledo. This corporate entity sued the city to have the law overturned because it could possibly be used to violate the corporation's rights. Now, mind you, it was only 12 hours after the election, so the people didn't even have time to try and use their law to do anything. They also asked the court to put a stay or a hold on the law so it couldn't be used by the people while the court decided if it was legal. As we go along, the state of Ohio joined the lawsuit, but not on the side of the people or on the side of Lake Erie. They joined the lawsuit on the side of the corporate polluter. The state was also worried that their authority and their right, they called it their right, to be the sole protectors of Lake Erie might be interfered with. And in their oral arguments in court, they even claimed that they own Lake Erie. To make a long story short, the federal judge ruled against the people's past rights of nature law and overturned it. So one judge, one corporation, and one state attorney overturns what 10,000 people voted for. What the people learned from this experience, though, is that their story can teach others and have a profound impact on changing culture. They learned through this process that the system's fixed and we need to break it. But there were 3 courageous residents who, without a lawyer representing them, they filed a lawsuit against the state of Ohio anyway. And they did this for a reason. They did it to show people what it would look like to file a lawsuit on behalf of nature. So just like the passage of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights showed people what a rights of nature law could look like, they wanted to show people what it could look like to use that law. Because you see, when something is the first or one of the first, the value is in showing people what a new system could look like, because it's difficult for people to envision something contrary to everything they've been taught. There were just oral arguments presented last week in the appeal filed by these brave residents. And if you can, keep watching on our website. In the next couple of days, we'll be posting the arguments that the people made, and they were really quite passionate. But the courts are only one pressure point in a movement to make systemic change. Of course, none of the plaintiffs who brought the Lake Erie Bill of Rights forward in this case expect the court to rule in theirs or the lake's favor. Not yet, anyway. But that shouldn't discourage others. Instead, it should motivate others, because now they have led and opened up a new path for people to follow. A single lawsuit attempting to recognize rights for the rightless isn't how change in law happens. Laws should reflect the moral values of a society. So by using these attempts to change the law, we are able to have discussions, debates, and dialogue, just like what Bob mentioned and is trying to, start here within the UCC and other churches. You get to have these discussions about rights of nature, and that starts changing and shifting people's mindsets about their relationship with nature, and then the laws will follow. And I always like to put this slide up only because, that's the Attorney General of the state of Ohio, and he says, let's save the lake legally after they invalidated the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Well, the people passed their law legally. I would say that they invalidated it illegally. But this is why those with the power are threatened by rights of nature. They recognize it as a shift in power and that it levels the playing field for both the community members and nature. Remember, the rightless cannot go to court and make claims that their rights are being violated. They don't have any. It's why slaves could not take their masters to court for violating their rights, or women could not take their husbands to court for violating their rights. Also remember that rights aren't regulated, and regulation is also a form of control. So the next question is, how does law change? Well, legislation is obviously one way. Judicial decisions that overturn precedent or recognize new rights is another. Remember, we didn't have any legislation passed that granted corporations rights, and there is no mention of corporate rights in the federal constitution or in our state constitutions. Yet as a culture, we somehow just accept that corporations have rights. And when culture changes in that way, that becomes the new accepted norms. In the 1960s, it was legal to have separate drinking fountains, schools, seats on buses, all determined by race. And when the people challenged those unjust laws, which involved direct action, like Rosa Parks and the young people who sat at the Woolworths counter, it causes people and society to reflect on what is just and moral. And when enough people in the culture start rejecting the laws and social codes as being unjust and voice that in multiple ways, that eventually puts pressure on the system, and it shows what the majority see as moral. And all those pressure points happening in many places, in many different ways, is what causes the laws to change. It isn't any one single action. And just an FYI, proposing and passing rights of nature laws currently is an act of civil disobedience, especially in states like Ohio and Florida, because the state legislatures have passed preemptive laws against rights of nature. So just the act of, because the legislature has said it's illegal and the people say, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway, that's civil disobedience. So I ask you, is it moral to put poisons and toxins into our air and water? Is it civilized to raise animals in factories where they never see the light of day or can even turn around? And if you say it's immoral and uncivilized, is that only because it harms humans or because it harms nature too? Of course, we don't have the luxury of time that it took past movements to make changes recognizing rights. We need to speed the process up if we believe that we have an obligation to the next generation. And this is where your resolution comes in, and where the other communities working on rights of nature initiatives in Florida, PA, Virginia, New Hampshire, Oregon, Ohio, Colorado, California, and other countries, both individually and collectively, pushing and challenging a system that only sees nature as property, as a commodity, and rightless. It's up to all of us, and together we can change culture and laws. So why is the Lake Erie Bill of Rights a win or a success, even if it was only on the books, so to speak, for a year? Because it garnered worldwide attention for rights of nature. It not only created a dialogue in Toledo, Ohio, but all over the country and around the world. It was this little spark that ignited something so much larger. It opened people's minds to a new way of thinking about nature and the environment. And just in case you don't recognize these, the bottom right-hand corner, that's Marky Miller, and she was a head organizer in Toledo, and that's her speaking at the United Nations about rights of nature. It also was featured on The Daily Show, and it was actually a clue on Jeopardy. So millions and millions of people were now exposed to even the term rights of nature. So I believe that together we can build a movement to make sustainability legal and leave future generations with healthy, livable, just communities. I want to thank you so much for inviting me today, and I hope your resolution is passed quickly and that the word spreads out to many other religious leaders and inspires them to join you. And also know that if you or anyone in your communities have questions regarding rights of nature, to please reach out. We have many resources available on our website, and people are willing to help other communities want to join this growing movement. So thank you.
Thank you, Tish. That was a terrific presentation. So glad to have you with us today. I'm now going to give people an opportunity to share questions that they might have for you. You can, if you want to type in a question for Tish or Bob or Joseph, you can do so by clicking in the icon, the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and then type in your question there. So while we wait for questions to be entered in there, Tish, I'll just go ahead and ask something that I think I've heard said, perhaps even in one of our previous webinars, which is if currently we're having trouble respecting the rights of humans, it seems a little ways off to think that we're going to start respecting the rights of nature. How do you respond to a comment such as that?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to be forced into it, whether we want to or not, with what's going on in the world. And it's also interesting because I think we have a problem making the connections, and I think we need to get better at that. Because even when I talk about Toledo and the fact that, you know, some people couldn't travel 100 miles to get water, you know, this becomes an environmental justice issue. And there's environmental racism that happens. But we don't talk about it in the same way. Or the permits, you know, people talk about, well, when we get back to nature and the environment, well, we have zoning laws, they'll say. Well, what zoning does is that allows you to relegate the harm and create a sacrifice zone within your community. Well, which part of the community do you think usually becomes the sacrifice zone? It's the poorer side of town, right? Maybe where the, you know, minorities live. And so, you know, tying this, so rights of nature would really help because it would also empower people in those those parts of the community or in those neighborhoods to also have standing to stand up for nature. And instead of saying, no, we don't accept, we have to accept so many parts per million of radioactivity, you know, going into our air or water. No, this is harming nature and us, and we're going to be able, we want to stop this and prohibit it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of connections that have to be made. You know, the COVID crisis, we also know, you know, the way we treat animals with I call them animal factories, they call them factory farms. But in the animal factories, that definitely affects the animals, their health, and then that can be transmitted to us. So yeah, I think it's all interconnected. We're just not very good at talking about it that way.
Thanks, great answer. We have a question here in the Q&A that comes from Robert. Robert asked, what role did communities of faith play in the Toledo story? Maybe we're hopeful that they played a role, a positive one. But,
yeah, there were some individual churches that did, and people who allowed us to have presentations, obviously, at the churches and things like that. So, I mean, I don't think I'm trying to think, I can't think back of any like congregation or anything that came out and publicly were like, oh, we're behind this 100%, we support this. But there were individual churches that helped, you know, they let us have, the group have meetings there. They hosted educational information about rights of nature. So that was all good.
Great, good to hear. Another question we have comes from Susie, who asks, there was a case in 1972 about, do trees have standing? Tish, do you know what happened with that?
Yeah, that was the Sierra Club, I believe, case. Well, they didn't get standing, obviously, because that's why we're in the position we're in today. But it's interesting because, you know, again, talking about how one thing can affect another, right? So that case was on the books, and that's part of why then other lawyers can look back at that case. And our organization did, the lawyers did look and and build on that. And what's interesting is our organization helped put rights of nature, helped the people in Ecuador draft when they were doing their new constitution, made suggestions about putting rights of nature into their constitution. That came about because 2 years prior, there was a little township in Pennsylvania that our organization helped draft a local law that had rights of nature. And it's funny how that little law, nothing happened here in the United States for 2 years, from 2006. And then in 2008, though, it caught the attention of someone in Ecuador. And they contacted our organization. So, don't ever think that just because what you're doing, maybe it didn't pass, or maybe it passed like Toledo and got overturned, or maybe you don't succeed on the first attempt. We've had lots of communities that have done multiple attempts at trying to pass rights of nature, that it doesn't have an impact. I think of it like planting seeds. We're all planting seeds and you don't know exactly when they're gonna sprout or where. So don't give up. Don't let any of these things that the opposition likes to point as losses. Not true. Not true. Even just attempting, that's a win.
Great. Thanks for that response. Another question is, where rights of nature resolutions have been passed, what tangible impacts did they have?
Well, there's lots of examples of things. I mean, I can just tell you about my home community, which is in Broadview Heights, Ohio. We passed a law and it got overturned and it had rights of nature in it, but we kept fighting and fighting in court. We didn't give up. And what was interesting is on the final time that we lost and our law got overturned, the drillers then stated they weren't going to drill anymore in our community anyway because we were way too litigious. So, again, looking at, is this a loss? Well, we lost in the courts, but it prevented new drilling from happening. We currently have a community in Pennsylvania, Grant Township, and there's a lot written about them. They've been featured in Rolling Stone 3 times now. But a very small rural community in Pennsylvania, about 750 residents, they're fighting an injection well because they care about their water so much. I mean, they're all on well water. If this injection well goes in and any of those chemicals seep into their water supply, they'll be out of water. But they've been in legal battles since 2016, I believe. And there's a movie coming out actually about rights of nature. It's called Invisible Hand. It's premiering September 4th. And it focuses a lot on their case. There's some other cases mentioned in it, and I believe the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is even in it. But what's interesting in Grant Township, the state, their environmental protection agency is called the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection. They actually sued the community for putting a law in place that protected the environment. So, again, it's this whole idea that all these efforts in different places, they create awareness and educate the public to shift their mind, because so many people believe that the Department of Environmental Protection or the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, that they're there to protect the environment. And it takes cases like this to shift people's thinking and go, wait a minute, who are they protecting? They're actually facilitating the harm and allowing it to happen. So again, that's why all these cases together, it's not any single one, are so important for this shift in our mindset and culture and how we think of nature and in protecting nature.
Great. Tish, if I understand correctly, there's a comment in the Q&A that's alluding to perhaps another case where that you could talk about in this light. So Jean says, could you talk about Pittsburgh and the issue of fracking, the effectiveness of the RON or RON laws there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in 2010, it was the city council in Pittsburgh that actually passed a rights of nature law that we helped them draft, that language. And Pittsburgh has a long history of environmental degradation and abuse. and their rivers were quite polluted, and they had they've changed their ways and have tried to clean up the city. And then fracking, the fracking boom in Pennsylvania hit around 2005, 2006. And it turned out that a huge tract of land, and a lot of people think that fracking can only be done like in big rural areas, but they do something called urban drilling. And also the injection of the waste, which is also dangerous, can be done in places that aren't necessarily rural. They found out a large parcel, there's cemetery actually within the city, had been leased for fracking. And so it's like you don't want to see. I mean, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, was also from the Pittsburgh area and was so instrumental in the environmental movement and talking about a healthy environment and the rights of a healthy environment. So yeah, they worked with us, and it was their city council that passed a law that recognized the rights of nature. That law currently has not been challenged, by the way, so it's still on the books there, but it has also not been challenged.
There's a comment also by Jean that perhaps you can respond to. She says, the one common element of all our current crises is the issue of othering, the belief that we are separate from nature, other people, and all other creatures. And she references something from the Haas Institute in Berkeley called Othering and Belonging. Any thoughts or responses to that?
Yeah, again, it's what we're taught, right? It's what we're taught to believe. And we always like to blame someone else, right? The others. And it's also, I mean, this disconnect that we have from nature, it's so interesting to me because I worked in schools before I did this and was in elementary schools. And I keep thinking about how we're taught in elementary school about the web of life and how everything is interconnected. And then it's somehow this shift that by the time we get to adults, that we're so separated from that web of life and nature itself. In Ohio, and I think in other states, like I mentioned a little bit, that we had this big, and you'll see the activists get really worked up when you say that you're going to do something harmful in the parks. And of course, I don't want anything to happen, to the parks. That's not the point. But the point is, and I've called legislators before and said, think about what you're saying, and other activist groups. You're willing to protect the park, but why aren't you, if it's too dangerous to do in a park, let's say it's fracking, if that's too dangerous to do there, then why is it okay to do it in other places? And we also don't think about important things like our energy source. We need energy. And yet what we do is we put it on a grid and sell it as a commodity to the highest bidder. Well, where does it come from? It's kind of like this whole disconnect. I was on a call yesterday about Lake Erie, and someone said, I talked to my community members and they don't even know where their water comes from. And it's again, well, it comes from the faucet, right? It's like people think, where does milk come from? It comes from the grocery store, Giant Eagle or Kroger's or wherever. We're so disconnected in so many ways that we need to really be more vocal. We need to help make these connections for people. And we think the education is just about the laws, but it's really not. I mean, it's about a lot of this and I look at it as a huge puzzle a lot of times, and that we have to connect the pieces to complete the puzzle for people.
Great, thank you. Kenneth asked a question that is along the lines of something I've kind of been turning over here. Kenneth writes, Western law decoupled nature from humans. Would starting the Reconnect all creation be part of a viable way to make protection stronger? And just along with that, I guess I'm wondering, is there kind of an impediment when trying to, I don't know, persuade people on this issue that it's like, well, rights are about human. It seems like you're redefining rights, and why would you, it seems like a manipulation to broaden this beyond humans. How do you get people to recouple and reconnect, given this decoupling history?
Right, and that's what I was trying to say, and when I, gave my presentation about that, that we, have this whole idea that in our culture, that our whole culture is based on rights, and not all cultures are. Um, like it's just inherent, like the fact that we need a law to tell us to not put poison in our water, it's just beyond me. But the idea of rights, and again, it's again, who decides? That's huge in this whole discussion about rights of nature and who has a voice. Our system is set up currently that we get the permit, right? We harm nature, and then when it becomes dead or is dying, we then look to money, right? Our whole system is based on capitalism, making money. And so we also look to money to solve the problem. So we somehow think that we can pour money into the problem to fix it, which isn't always the case. Sometimes you have a dead river or a dead lake and it's dead. Doesn't matter how much money you put in, you might not be able to bring it back. This idea that we can buy our way out of it. I mean, that's the carbon credit idea. It's the idea that if a corporation wants to do harm in one place and they're going to destroy wetlands, that they can somehow create wetlands to make up for that somewhere else. It's something that took nature maybe thousands of years to create, but somehow a corporation can just recreate it by putting some money in. They'll dig a hole and put some plants in, and all of a sudden it's a wetland, and that's not necessarily so. So again, it's this whole idea of shifting our mindset on how we view nature, our relationship with nature, how our laws are set up to treat nature, and efforts like Toledo and Florida and what you guys are doing. That's all what we need to happen to shift people's minds and to have these dialogues and conversations.
Great. Well, we're approaching the end of our time. I'll let both you and Bob have the final word on suggested actions people can take or further resources people can dive into if they want to read a book-length treatment of this issue. What would you suggest for further education and further action from here on?
I'll just really quickly, if you go to our website, we do have a whole tab on rights of nature. So if you click on that, then there's a lot of resources and information there, and that's a start. And I'll let Bob give other.
David Boyd, a Canadian lawyer, has the book called The Rights of Nature, which is quite good synopsis, crossing many cultural settings, as well as in the US. That's a good resource. Secondly, I would also encourage the UCC folks here to get discussions in your church, and I'm looking for support on that rights of resolution because I'd like to see this go to the synod.
Great. Thank you so much, Tish, Bob, and Joseph for joining us today. It's been really a great conversation, lots of insights and knowledge shared, and it seems like there's some good energy around this and to make this a successful effort for a resolution.